The quick unraveling of the Blitzkrieg. It's important not to fall for appearances. Looking closely, the Third Reich's project for repeating the Blitzkrieg's victory in the West, but this time in the East, started to show problems in the very first weeks of the gigantic confrontation. On this, the diaries of Joseph Goebbels are revealing. In the immediate lead up to the assault, he stresses the unstoppable might of the imminent German attack, without a doubt the most powerful the world has ever known. No one could seriously oppose the strongest army in history. Therefore, we are before a triumphal march without precedent. I consider the Russian military force to be very weak, even weaker than the Führer believes. If anything is a sure thing, it is this. In fact, Hitler is no less confident. Some months earlier, with a Bulgarian diplomat, he referred to the Soviet army as but a joke. However, from the start, the invaders found, despite everything, unpleasant surprises. On June 25th, during the first aerial attack on Moscow, the anti aircraft defenses proved to be so effective that the Luftwaffe is forced to limit itself to a reduced amount of night raids. It took only 10 days of war for the pre war assumptions to be shaken. On July 2nd, Goebbels writes in his diary, "Overall, the fighting is hard and stubborn. We can in no way speak of a walk in the park. The Red regime mobilized the people. This course of events continued on, and the mood of the Nazi leaders changed radically, as is repeatedly demonstrated in the diary written by Goebbels. July 24th. We can have no doubt whatsoever about the fact that the Bolshevik regime, which has existed for nearly a quarter century, left its mark on the peoples of the Soviet Union. Therefore, it would be right to announce, and with great clarity, before the German people, the difficulty of the struggle that rages in the East. It is necessary to say to the nation that this operation is very difficult, but we can overcome it, and we will overcome it." August 1st. In the Führer's headquarters, it is also openly admitted that they were somewhat mistaken in their evaluation of the Soviet military force. The Bolsheviks reveal a greater resistance than we had suspected. In particular, the material resources available to them were greater than we thought. August 19th. Privately, the Führer is very irritated with himself for having been misled to such an extent regarding the strength of the Bolsheviks by the reports by German agents coming from the Soviet Union. In particular, the underestimation of the enemy's armored vehicles and planes caused us many problems. He suffers a lot because of this. We're dealing with a grave crisis. Put in comparison, the previous campaigns were like a walk in the park. Regarding the West, the Führer has no reason to worry. With rigor and objectivity, we Germans always overestimated the enemy, except in this case with the Bolsheviks. September 16th. We have totally underestimated the strength of the Bolsheviks. Scholars in military strategy stress the unforeseen difficulties that soon challenge that powerful war machine, experienced and cloaked in the myth of invincibility upon its entry into the Soviet Union. The Battle of Smolensk, the second half of July 1941, is particularly significant for the success of the Eastern Front. Up until now, it has been overshadowed by research into other events. The observation is from an illustrious German historian who passes on these eloquent entries from a diary written by General Fedor von Bock from the 20th and 26th of July. Quote, "The enemy seeks to recapture Smolensk at all costs and is constantly sending in new forces. The theory expressed by some that the enemy acts without plans is not reflected in the facts. We've verified that the Russians have brought up across the front a new and compact deployment of forces. In many areas, they seek to go on the offensive. It's surprising for an adversary which suffered so many blows. They must possess an unbelievable amount of resources. In fact, our troops still lament the power of the enemy artillery." End quote. Even more worried, or even decidedly pessimistic, is Admiral Wilhelm Kenner, leader of counter-espionage, who in speaking with the General von Bock on July 17 says, "I see it as very bleak. Not only does the Soviet army not break down in the first days and weeks of the assault, but to the contrary, It offers tenacious resistance and is also well commanded, as revealed by, among other things, the decision by Stalin at the time of halting the German advance at a point decided by him. The results of this astute military command are revealed as well in the diplomatic sphere. It is precisely because it is impressed by the fierce battle around Smolensk that Japan, present there as an observer, decides to reject the request by the Third Reich for it to join the war against the Soviet Union. The analysis of the vehemently anti communist German historian is fully confirmed by Russian scholars who distinguished themselves as champions in the struggle against Stalinism in the wake of the Khrushchev Report. The plans of the Blitzkrieg were already sunk by the middle of July. In this context, in no way formal is the tribute paid to the Soviet Army's splendid defense by Churchill and F.D. Roosevelt on August 14, 1941. Even outside diplomatic and governing circles in Great Britain, we're informed by a diary entry from Beatrice Webb. Common citizens, including those of a conservative orientation, show lively interest in their surprising courage and initiative, as well as the magnificent equipment of the Russian armed forces, the only sovereign state able to oppose the almost mythical power of Hitler's Germany. In Germany itself, just 3 weeks after the start of Operation Barbarossa, rumors start to circulate which deeply question the regime's triumphalist line. It's what appears in the diaries of an eminent German intellectual of Jewish origin. Judging by appearances, in the East, we suffer immense losses. We had underestimated the strength of the resistance by the Russians, which was inexhaustible in terms of men and military resources. For a long time, read as an example of political military ignorance or even blind faith in the Third Reich, the extremely cautious approach by Stalin in the weeks leading up to the outbreak of hostilities now appears under new light. The concentration of forces by the Wehrmacht along the entire front with the USSR, the violation of Soviet airspace, and another number of provocations had a single aim: attract the bulk of the Red Army as close as possible to the border. Hitler intended to win the war in a single gigantic battle. Even valiant generals were enticed by this trap, and expecting the onslaught of the enemy, insisted on a massive relocation of troops towards the border. Stalin categorically rejected the request, insisting on the necessity of maintaining plenty of reserves at a considerable distance from the front line. Later, after reading the strategic plans by Operation Barbossa's architects, Marshal George K. Zhukov recognized the correctness of the line pursued by Stalin. Hitler's orders counted on the relocation of the bulk of our troops toward the border, with the intention of surrounding them and destroying them. As a matter of fact, in the months following the invasion of the USSR, arguing with his generals, Hitler observed, "The problem of the Russian territory, the infinite width of the territory makes concentrating on decisive points necessary." Later, in a conversation, he clarified his thinking about the already initiated Operation Barbarossa. In world history, there had been, until now, only 3 battles of annihilation: Cannae, Sedan, and Tannenberg. We can be proud of the fact that 2 of them had been victoriously fought by German armies. However, for Germany, the third and greatest battle of annihilation and submission, which Hitler had longed for, is increasingly complicated, and 1 week later he sees himself obligated to recognize that Operation Barbarossa had seriously underestimated their enemy. The military preparations by the Russians must be considered incredible. The desire by the chess player to justify the failure of his forecasts is apparent here. However, the previously cited English military scholar reaches the same conclusions. The reason for the French defeat lies not in the quantity or quality of their resources, but in their military doctrine. Further, an excessively advanced deployment of the army had a disastrous effect because it gravely compromised their strategic flexibility. A similar mistake was made in Poland as well, driven by national pride and overconfidence in the soldiers. None of this happened in the Soviet Union. More important than the individual battles is the overall picture. The Stalinist system was able to mobilize the immense majority of the population and nearly all resources. Particularly extraordinary was the Soviet ability, In such a difficult situation as the one that arose in the first months of the war, of evacuating and later reconverting to military production a considerable number of industries. Yes, created 2 days after the German invasion, the evacuation committee managed to move to the east 1,500 major industrial companies after titanic operations of great logistic complexity. Moreover, that process of relocation had already begun in the weeks or months before Hitler's aggression, which is another confirmation of the fanciful character of the accusations delivered by Khrushchev. There's more. To some degree, the Soviet leadership understood the scenario of the war looming on the horizon as they were promoting the industrialization of the country. With a radical turn with respect to the previous situation, they identified Asian Russia as a key point, at a distance to and sheltered from possible aggressors. In fact, Stalin had insisted repeatedly and vigorously on this. On January 31st, 1931, he pushes forward the creation of a new and well equipped industrial base in the Ural Mountains, Siberia, and Kazakhstan. A few years later, the report read on January 26, 1934, at the 17th Congress of the CPSU had with satisfaction called attention to the powerful industrial development that has been achieved in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and the Tatar, Buryat, and Bashkirian republics in the Ural Mountains, in eastern and western Siberia, in the Far East, etc. Trotsky didn't miss the implications of all of this. A few years later, while analyzing the dangers of the war and the Soviet Union's level of preparation, and in highlighting the results achieved by the planned economy in the military sphere, he observed the industrialization of remote regions, especially Siberia, gives the steppes and forest regions new importance. Only now does great territorial expanse assume its full value, making the lightning warfare traditionally favored and prepared for by German high command more difficult than ever. It's precisely in the field of the industrial apparatus, built in preparation for the war, where the Third Reich is confronted with the even more bitter surprises, as shown in Hitler's notes. November 29th, 1941. How is it possible that such a primitive people can reach such technical objectives in such a short period of time? August 26, 1942. With respect to Russia, it is incontestable that Stalin raised the standard of living. The Russian people don't go hungry at the moment when Operation Barbarossa was launched. In general, it's necessary to recognize that they have built factories of similar importance to the Hermann Göring Reichswerk, where 2 years ago nothing but unknown villages existed. We come across railway lines that aren't on the maps. At this time, it's worthwhile to consult three scholars, each very different, one Russian and the two others Western. The first, who was a director of the Soviet Institute of Military History and who participated in the militant anti-Stalinism of Gorbachev years, appears motivated by the intention of furthering and radicalizing the investigations by the Khrushchev report. However, from the results of the study, he feels obligated to formulate a much more nuanced judgment. Without being an expert, much less the genius portrayed by official propaganda, even in the years before the start of the war, Stalin gives particular attention to issues of defense, the defense of industry, and the war economy as a whole. Yes, at the strictly military level, only through effort and mistakes, including serious mistakes, and thanks to the hard practice of daily military life, he gradually learns the principles of strategy. In other fields, his thinking proves to be more developed than many Soviet military leaders. Thanks as well to the long experience of managing political power, Stalin never loses sight of the central role of the war economy, and he contributed to strengthening the USSR's resistance with the relocation of war industries to the interior. It's almost impossible to overestimate the importance of that enterprise. Finally, the Soviet leader pays great attention to the moral political dimension of the war. In that field, he had totally unconventional ideas, as shown by the courageous military decisions of celebrating the anniversary of the October Revolution on November 7th of 1941 in a besieged Moscow harassed by the Nazi enemy. In conclusion, One can say that with respect to the career military officers and his inner circle, Stalin demonstrated his more universal mindset. It is a mindset, we can add, that doesn't neglect any of the smaller aspects of the life and morale of the soldiers. Informed that they didn't have cigarettes, and thanks as well to his ability to handle an enormous workload, at a crucial moment in the Battle of Stalingrad, Stalin found the time to call Akai Mekzalide, party chief in Akbashnia, with the principal region for production of tobacco. Our soldiers can no longer smoke. Without cigarettes, the front won't hold. In their positive evaluation of Stalin as a military leader, two Western authors go further. While Khrushchev stresses the overwhelming initial success of the Wehrmacht, the first of the aforementioned expert references these same facts in very different terms. It's not shocking that the largest invasion in military history had achieved initial successes. The response of the Red Army after the devastating blows by the German invasion of June of 1941 was the greatest feat of arms that the world had ever seen. The second scholar, a professor at an American military academy, starting from the understanding of the conflict in terms of its long duration, the attention given to the rear and the front, its economic and political dimension, as well as the military aspect of the war, speaks of Stalin as a great strategist and the first true strategist of the 20th century. Obviously, we can debate and qualify these flattering judgments. It's true, however, at least as it relates to the topic of war, that the evaluation made by Khrushchev loses all credibility. Even more so because, at this crucial moment, the USSR proved itself quite prepared for another essential point of view. Let us again consult Goebbels, who, upon explaining the unforeseen difficulties of Operation Barbarossa, points to another factor besides the enemy's military power. Quote, for our men of confidence and our spies, it was almost impossible to penetrate the Soviet interior. We couldn't get a precise overview. The Bolsheviks made a great effort in fooling us. Of the kinds of arms they possessed, especially heavy weapons, we didn't have a clue. It was the exact opposite to what had taken place in France, where we knew everything in practice and couldn't be surprised in any way. End quote. Lacking common sense and the mass deportations of entire populations. As the author of a book in 1913 that would earn him recognition as a theorist on the national question, and as the People's Commissar for Nationalities not long after the October Revolution, Stalin had earned the recognition from such a diverse set of personalities as Arendt and De Gasperi for the way in which he had done his job. His thoughts on the national question had finally led him to an essay on linguistics aimed at demonstrating that, far from disappearing after a determined social class is overthrown, the language of a nation has notable stability, just as a nation using it enjoys notable stability. That essay would also contribute to consolidating Stalin's reputation as a theorist of the national question. Even in 1965, despite the context of a strong condemnation of Stalin, Louis Althusser will attribute to him the merit of having opposed the madness that sought at all costs to turn the language into an ideological superstructure. Thanks to these simple pages, the French philosopher will conclude, we understand that the use of the class criterion wasn't without its limits. In the 1956 campaign to delegitimize and liquidate him, Khrushchev couldn't ignore Stalin as a theorist and politician who paid particular attention to the national question. In condemning the mass deportations of entire nationalities, the secret report declares, quote, it's not necessary to be a Marxist Leninist to understand that any common sense person would ask how it's possible to make entire nations responsible for hostile acts without exception for women, children, elderly, communists, and members of the Komsomol communist youth, reaching the point of enforcing generalized repression against them, sending them into misery and suffering without any other motive but vengeance for some crime perpetrated by individuals or isolated groups. End quote. The horror of collective punishment and deportation imposed on populations suspected of lacking patriotic loyalty is beyond question. Sadly, far from referencing the madness of a single individual, this practice deeply characterizes the Second 30 Years' War starting with Tsarist Russia, that, although allied with the liberal West, experiences a wave of deportations of dimensions unknown in Europe. During the First World War, in which around 1 million people are cut up, especially those of Jewish or Germanic origin, of lesser dimensions, but much more significant, are the measures during the Second World War that affect Japanese Americans, deported and enclosed in concentration camps. The expulsion and deportation of entire populations, aside from having the aim of removing a potential fifth column, could be pursued from the purpose of remaking or redefining political geography. During the first half of the 20th century, this practice is widespread across the planet. From the Middle East, where Jews had just escaped the final solution, forced Arabs and Palestinians to flee, to as far as Asia, where the partition of the British Empire's crown jewel into India and Pakistan is achieved through the century's largest forced migration. Sticking to the Asian continent for now, it's worthwhile to look at what happened in a region administered by a figure, or in the name of a figure, the 14th Dalai Lama, who would later obtain the Nobel Peace Prize and become synonymous with nonviolence. In July of 1949, all the Han residents, therefore many generations, in Lhasa were expelled from Tibet, with the aim to both confront the possible activity of a fifth column as well as to make its demographic makeup more homogeneous. Before us is a practice not only realized in the most varied of geographic and political cultural locations, but supported theoretically in those years by leading political figures. In 1938, David Ben-Gurion, the eventual founding father of Israel, declared, "I am in favor of the forced relocation of Arab Palestinians. I see nothing immoral in this." In fact, coherent to that program, he will put into practice 10 years later. But here it's necessary to concentrate our attention on Eastern Central Europe, where a little discussed tragedy takes place, yet it's among the largest of the 20th century. In total, around 16.5 million Germans were forced to abandon their homes, and 2.5 million of them didn't survive this enormous ethnic cleansing or counter-ethnic cleansing operation. In this case, it's possible to make a direct comparison between Stalin on one hand and the Western and pro-Western statesmen on the other. What position did the latter take in that situation? As always, we'll analyze by beginning with a historiography that can't be suspected of sympathies towards the Soviet Union. Quote, starting in 1942, it was the British government that encouraged a generalized transfer of populations from the Eastern German territories and from the Sudetenland. It was the Deputy Undersecretary who went further than anyone else in requesting an investigation to determine, quote, if Great Britain should encourage the transfer to Siberia of the Germans from East Prussia and Upper Silesia, end quote. Speaking of the House of Commons on December 15th, 1944, on the planned transfer of several million Germans, Churchill clarified his thinking as follows, quote, from what we are able to understand, expulsion is the most satisfactory and long-lasting solution. There will no longer be a mixing of populations provoking endless disorder, as happened in the case of Alsace-Lorraine. A clean cut will be made. I'm not alarmed by the expected separation of populations, nor am I alarmed by the massive relocations, which in modern conditions are much easier than they were in the past. End quote. F.D. Roosevelt later adhered to the deportation plans in June of 1943. Almost at the same time, Stalin gave into pressure from Venice to expel the Germans from the Sudetenland upon its restoration to Czechoslovakia. An American historian comes to the following conclusion, quote, in the end, on the question of the expulsion of Germans from Czechoslovakia and post-war Poland, in practice there wasn't any difference between communist and non-communist politicians. On this issue, Benins and Gottwald, Mikołajczyk and Bierut, Stalin and Churchill all spoke the same language. End quote. This conclusion is already enough to refute the black and white position implicit in the Khrushchev report. In truth, at least with regard to the Germans of Eastern Europe, it wasn't Stalin who took the initiative with respect to mass deportations of entire peoples. The blame was not given out in an equal manner. The same American historian just cited ends up recognizing this. In Czechoslovakia, John Masaryk expressed his conviction according to which the Germans don't have a soul, and the words they best understand are the bursts of machine gun. Nor is this a remotely isolated attitude. Even the Czech Catholic Church made its voice heard. Monsignor Bohumil Stasek, the priest of Wiesenhard, declared, "After 1,000 years, the moment has arrived to settle matters with the Germans, who are evil, and for whom the commandment, 'Love your neighbor,' doesn't apply." In those circumstances, a German witness recalls, "We often had to seek help from the Russians against the Czechs, which the Russians frequently offered, so long as it didn't involve laying a hand on a woman." There's more, however. Again, we turn to the American historian. In the former Nazi camp of Theresienstadt, the interned Germans asked themselves what would have happened to them if the local Russian commander hadn't protected them from the Czechs. A secret report sent to the Central Committee of the Communist Party in Moscow relayed requests made for the Soviet soldiers to stay. "If the Red Army leaves, we are finished." The demonstrations of that hate towards the Germans are evident. The Czechs don't kill them, but they torment them as if they were wild animals. They consider them animals. In effect, the American historian cited here continues, "The horrible treatment by the Czechs led them to desperation. According to Czech statistics, in 1946 alone, 5,558 Germans committed suicide. Something similar happens in Poland." In conclusion, quote, "The Germans thought the Russian military personnel were much more humane and responsible than the local Czechs and Polish. On occasions, the Russians gave food to hungry German children, while the Czech would let them die of starvation. Sometimes the Soviet troops gave a ride in their vehicles to exhausted Germans on their long journey to leave the country, while the Czechs only looked at them with disdain or indifference." End quote. The American historian speaks generally of Czechs and Polish, but isn't completely correct in doing so, as emerges in his very own account. Quote, "The question of the Germans' expulsion caused a serious problem for the Czech communists, as well as for the communists in other countries. During the war, the communist position, as articulated by Georgy Dmitriev in Moscow, was that the Germans responsible for the war and for its crimes should be put on trial and condemned, while the German workers and peasants should be re-educated." End quote. In fact, in Czechoslovakia, it was the communists, upon taking power in February 1948, who put an end to the persecution of the few ethnic minorities who had remained. Contrary to what Khrushchev insinuates, in comparison to the bourgeois leaders of Western and Eastern Central Europe, at least in this case, Stalin and the communist movement led by him proved to be less lacking in common sense. It was not by chance. While toward the end of the war, Franklin Delano Roosevelt insists he is more thirsty than ever for German blood, because of the atrocities they committed, and even entertains the idea for some time of castrating such a perverse people, Stalin's position is quite different. And just after Operation Barbarossa is unleashed, he states that the Soviet resistance can count on the support of all the best men in Germany, even the German people under the command of Hitler's officers. The statement made in February of 1942 is particularly solemn. Quote, "It would be ridiculous to see in the Hitlerite clique the German people or the German state. Historical experience proves that Hitlers come and go, but the German people, the German state, remains. The strength of the Red Army resides in the fact that it doesn't nurture, nor could it nurture, any hatred towards other people, and therefore couldn't even nurture hatred for the German people. It is educated in the spirit of the equality of all peoples and all races, in the spirit of respect for the rights of other peoples." End quote. Even an uncompromising anti-communist like Ernst Nolte is forced to recognize that the position taken by the Soviet Union in relation to the German people doesn't carry those racist tones that are sometimes found in Western powers. To finish this point, if not equally distributed, the lack of common sense was quite widespread among political leaders of the 20th century. So far, I have concentrated on the deportations caused by war or by the risk of war, or by the reorganization and revision of political geography. At least until the 40s, in the United States, the deportations carried out in urban centers are widespread. Urban centers that seek to be for whites only, as the posters warn upon entry. Aside from African Americans, Mexicans are also targeted, reclassified as non whites in the 1930 census. Thus, thousands of workers and their families, including many Americans of Mexican origin, are deported to Mexico. The expulsion and deportation measures in the cities that seek to be for whites only or for Caucasians only don't even spare Jews. The secret report depicts Stalin as a tyrant so lacking a sense of reality that, in taking collective measures against determined ethnic groups, he didn't hesitate in punishing the innocent or even party comrades. What comes to mind is the case of the German exiles, the majority of them declared enemies of Hitler, who, soon after the war begins with Germany, are collectively confined to French concentration camps. But it's useless to search for any effort at a comparative analysis in Khrushchev's speech. His goal is to upend two themes that, until that moment, had been widespread, not only in official propaganda, but also in journalism and international public opinion. To transform the great leader who had decisively contributed to the destruction of the Third Reich into a foolish amateur who has trouble figuring out a world map that is eminent theorist of the national question is revealed to have lacked the most elementary common sense in that field. The acknowledgments previously given to Stalin are all blamed on a cult of personality that now must be eliminated once and for all. The cult of personality in Russia, from Kerensky to Stalin. The denunciation of the cult of personality is Khrushchev's principal argument. However, in his report, the question that ought to seem obligatory doesn't show up. Are we faced with the vanity or narcissism of a single political leader, or with the phenomenon of a more general character that takes hold in a determined objective context? It may be interesting to read the observations made by Bukharin while in the United States as they finalized the preparations for their entry into the First World War. Quote, so that the state machinery was as prepared as possible for military affairs, it itself became a military organization, which is commanded by a dictator. This dictator is President Wilson. Emergency powers were given to him. He has nearly absolute power, and in the people they seek to encourage submissiveness towards the great president, like in the Byzantine Empire of old where they deified their monarch. End quote. In situations of acute crisis, the personalization of power is often combined with the veneration of the leader who holds power. When he arrives in France in December of 1918, the victorious American president is hailed as the savior, and his 14-point speech is compared to the Sermon on the Mount. The political developments that take place in the United States between the Great Depression and the Second World War are worth considering. Having ascended to the presidency on the promise of solving a deeply troubling socio-economic situation, F.D. Roosevelt is elected for 4 consecutive terms, although he died at the start of the 4th term, a unique case in the history of his country. Aside from the long duration of his presidency, what's unusual are the hopes and expectations placed on it. Leading figures speak of a national dictator and invite the new president to demonstrate all his strength. Become a tyrant, a despot, a true monarch. During the Great War, we took our constitution and put it aside until the end of the war. The continuation of the state of emergency demands we don't allow ourselves to be impeded by excessive legal scruples. The nation's new leader is called upon to be, and is soon defined as, an individual of providence. That is, in the words of Cardinal O'Connell, a man sent by God. The average person writes to and expresses themselves to FDR in even more emphatic terms, declaring that they look to him almost as if they were looking to God, and hope to one day place him in the immortal pantheon alongside Jesus. Invited to behave as a dictator or a man of providence, the new president makes ample use of his executive power from the first hours of his mandate. In his inaugural message, he demands ample power, as great as that which would be conceded to me if we were really invaded by a foreign enemy. With the outbreak of hostilities in Europe, even before Pearl Harbor, F.D. Roosevelt begins on his own initiative dragging the country towards war on the side of Britain. Subsequently, with a unilateral executive order, he imposes the confinement of all Japanese American citizens in concentration camps, including women and children. It's a presidency that, while it enjoys widespread popular support, leads to warnings of the danger of totalitarianism. This happens during the Great Depression. It's former President Hoover, in particular, who makes that accusation. And it especially happens in the months that precede the entry into the Second World War, when Senator Burton K. Wheeler accuses F.D. Roosevelt of exercising dictatorial power and of promoting a totalitarian form of government. At least from the point of view of the president's adversaries, totalitarianism and the cult of personality had crossed over the Atlantic. Certainly, the phenomenon that we're investigating here, the personalization of power and the cult of personality linked to it, is present only in embryonic form in the American Republic, protected by the ocean from any attempted invasion, and with a political tradition quite different from Russia's. One must concentrate on that country. Let's see what happens between February and October of 1917. Therefore, before the Bolshevik ascension to power, driven by his personal vanity, but also by his desire to stabilize the situation, we find Kerensky taking Napoleon as a model. He inspects the troops with a hand tucked into the front of his jacket. Meanwhile, on the desk in his office in the War Ministry stood a bust of the Emperor of the French. The results from his performance don't take long. Poetry portraying homage to Kerensky as the new Napoleon flourishes. In the lead up to the summer offensive that was supposed to reverse the fortunes of the Russian army, the cult dedicated to Kerensky in certain circles reaches high point. Quote, everywhere he was proclaimed a hero. The soldiers lifted him on their shoulders, showered him with flowers, throwing them at his feet. A British nurse had the opportunity to witness it, surprised at the scene of army men kissing him, his car, and the ground he walked on. Many fell to their knees and prayed, others cried. End quote. As you can see, it doesn't make much sense to blame Stalin's narcissism, as Khrushchev does, for the exalted state that the cult of personality reaches in the USSR after a certain amount of time. In fact, when Kaganovich suggests substituting the term Marxism-Leninism for Marxism-Leninism-Stalinism, the leader to whom the tribute is directed responds, you want to compare Dick to a guard tower. At least when compared to Kerensky, Stalin appears more modest. It's confirmed by the attitude that he takes in concluding a war that's actually been won, not in his imagination like in the case of the Menshevik leader, the lover of Napoleonic poses. Immediately after the victory parade, a group of marshals reach out to Molotov and Malenkov. They propose to them the commemoration of victory achieved in the Great Patriotic War by offering the title Hero of the Soviet Union to Stalin, who nonetheless rejects the offer. The Soviet leader also sought to escape rhetorical excess on the occasion of the Potsdam Conference. Both Churchill and Truman took their time walking among Berlin's ruins. Stalin showed no such interest. Without drawing attention, he arrived by train and even ordered Zhukov to cancel any welcoming ceremony with a military band and an honor guard. 4 years later, on the eve of his 70th birthday, a conversation took place in the Kremlin that's worth sharing. Quote, he, Stalin, called in Malenkov and warned them, don't even think about honoring me again with a star. But Comrade Stalin, on an anniversary like this, the people would not understand. It is not up to the people. I don't want to argue. No personal initiative. Understand me? Of course, Comrade Stalin. But the Politburo members think. Stalin interrupted Malenkov and declared the discussion closed. End quote. Naturally, one can say that in the circumstances referred to here, political calculation plays a more or less important role, and it would be extremely odd if it didn't. It's a fact, however, that personal vanity didn't win out, and even less so when decisions of vital political character are at stake. Over the course of the Second World War, Stalin invites his colleagues to express themselves frankly. He actively argues and even fights with Molotov, who, for his part, despite being careful so as to not put the hierarchy in doubt, remains unchanged in his opinion. Judging by the testimony of Admiral Nikolai Kuznetsov, the supreme leader particularly appreciated those comrades who thought for themselves and didn't hesitate in frankly expressing their point of view. Interested as he is in pointing to Stalin as the only one responsible for the catastrophes that struck the USSR, far from eliminating the cult of personality, Khrushchev only transforms it into a negative cult. The vision based upon in principio erat Stalin, in the beginning there was Stalin, remains unshaken. Further, in confronting the most tragic chapter of the Soviet Union's history, the terror and the bloody purges that were widespread and didn't even spare the Communist Party itself, the secret report has no doubt. It's a horror to be exclusively blamed on a person with a thirst for power and possessed by bloody paranoia.